the third speaker for the day, and we're recording the presentation again. It's my great pleasure to introduce Steph Keeble. So it's actually quite remarkable that you managed to fit us in. Thank you, Steph. And I think we've had two amazing presentations already, but you bring a unique set of experience and knowledge that I think will really complement well what we've been doing so far. So just to provide a little bit of background about Steph, she's a social science graduate with 28 years of experience in the third sector. That's pretty impressive. I think 28 years of experience. And it's also amazing all the different things and areas that you have worked in, from supporting people with substance abuse issues to, that seems to be a key area, supporting people who experience domestic abuse, and then also playing a key role in community coordinated responses to domestic abuse, which is obviously a key area. Now, Steph is director of Birmingham LGBT, and that is a registered charity and company limited by guarantee that provides a range of services to the LGBT community in Birmingham. So it's very local, and it's really amazing what you do. Like, there is sexual health promotion, but also mental health and wellbeing services, support for older people, but also youth work, and a range of other projects. And so Birmingham LGBT has won a lot of awards and has gained a lot of recognition for the amazing work you do. And you can I think you're kind of drawing on all of that experience today. So Steph's talk today is entitled Trauma in the LGBTQ Community. And without further ado, I just pass on to you, Steph, and look forward to what you have to say.
Thank you. Shall I share my screen to start? Hopefully this will work. It did before. Okay, so thank you for inviting me, and thank you for the introduction. So you've heard a little bit about me. I actually started working in the third sector as a volunteer when I was studying at Worcester Rape Crisis back in the day, where we were rattling tins to pay phone bills, and have spent a lot of time as a practitioner working with victims of complex trauma and trauma, working in rape crisis centres, domestic abuse centres, mental health services, mainly with women, and then in later years developing and delivering services to the lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans community. We had a bit of an oversight of what we do. This is us. So this is Birmingham LGBT Centre, Health and Wellbeing Centre. We're opposite Radisson Blu in the city centre. We have clinical space, we have a CAF space, training room, counselling spaces. So we're very blessed. We have a great space for people to meet in, and we deliver a range of services, as was mentioned, which include wellbeing support, counselling, sexual health promotion, work with young people, work with older people. We support people seeking asylum, although we don't provide immigration advice. They have access to all of our services. And we also provide IDVA services across the West Midlands, so independent domestic abuse services. So we're still working with people who have experienced complex trauma in their lifetime. Got a few definitions. You may have had, I didn't listen to the first two presentations, so you may have had some of this and some of the impact of trauma on the brain. The definition of trauma in the widest sense is anything that is deeply distressing or disturbing. And psychological trauma is unique to the person who experiences the event and concerns an overwhelm in terms of their ability to integrate their traumatic experience into their life experience. So one of the things that we're looking to do when we're supporting survivors is to ensure they can integrate those traumatic experiences. Type 1 trauma refers to a single incident traumas which might be acute, shock-related or life-threatening, i.e. a severe car accident, whereas type 2 trauma refers to complex or repetitive trauma. Complex trauma may be experienced during childhood, i.e. Childhood sexual abuse or neglect, or during adults. So adults, e.g., for example, during war, people who go to war may witness and experience complex trauma, or living with domestic abuse on an ongoing basis. So, post-traumatic stress disorder, it was really interesting because back in the day when I worked for Rape Crisis, we used to spend 8 or 9 months training volunteers before they supported people on the phones. And one of the things that had been identified was something called, what we called rape trauma syndrome. And what that would now be seen as is post-traumatic stress disorder. The women's movement spent years trying to get the experiences of rape and domestic abuse recognised and clinically diagnosed. I'm not a clinician, but I do have a lot of experience of working with people with trauma. And in terms of that, there's a really good book if people are interested called Trauma and Recovery. I'll put the details in the chat after, which looks at the experiences of living with rape and domestic abuse and how that leads to the development of complex trauma, and also ways to support people. So post-traumatic stress disorder is a mental health condition that's triggered by a terrifying event, either experiencing it or witnessing it. Symptoms may include flashbacks, nightmares, and severe anxiety, as well as uncontrollable thoughts about the events. And flashbacks are like intense feelings of reliving an experience. Complex PTSD includes many of the symptoms of PTSD, but also shame, relationship problems, maladaptive coping strategies. So what I mean by that is things like self-harm or substance misuse, and disassociation, so out-of-body experiences, not feeling grounded or whole. Complex post-traumatic stress disorder is caused by long-lasting trauma that continues or repeats for months or even years. And I've added here vicarious trauma, which is an occupational challenge for people working with and volunteering in the fields of victim services, and is trauma experienced because of the continuous exposure to victims of trauma and violence and listening to their stories and experiences. And I know when I spoke to somebody before agreeing to do this, that could be something that some researchers could experience if you're hearing fairly horrendous stories about traumatic experience in order to do research and move into these issues or wider issues. So trauma in the LGBT community. I started off wanting to talk a little bit about what I've called systemic trauma. So we gave some definitions there about trauma introduced by a one-off event or introduced by ongoing experience of domestic abuse. People can also experience systemic trauma when they grow up and experience regular institutional discrimination and minority stress. So, for example, the experience of growing up in a racist society and experiencing racism on a daily basis. So what I've identified this is discrimination-based trauma and minority stress. Minority stress theory is a theory that's been developed to explain LGBTQ's people's experiences of growing up, and it's that ongoing experience of microaggressions, which are small daily challenges, internalized homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. So internalizing the messages that belong out there, growing up in a society that tells you heterosexuality is the norm and anything else by definition is abnormal. So external heterosexism and cisgenderism. And there's been a lot of research into that, and that has linked minority stress and internalized homophobia, biphobia, the experiences of prejudice and discrimination on a daily basis, with LGBTQ people's experiences of poor mental health. And some studies have found that LGBTQ plus people are 3 times as likely to experience PTSD than their heterosexual and cisgendered counterparts. And they also have high rates of suicidal ideation. I'm just going to move that on and give you some stats just before I do. So heteronormativity. So what I was referring to then, I use quite a lot of big words like heterosexism or heteronormativity, is the belief that heterosexuality is the norm. So I've just put this slide up, which has a knife and fork talking to two chopsticks and asking which one of you is the fork, which sort of sums that up really. It sums up that experience of marginalisation and people's experiences not always feeling validated in society. So put up a few stats in line with this. So hate crime and domestic abuse. So 1 in 5 LGBT people, 21%, have experienced a hate crime or incident due to their sexual orientation and or gender identity in the last 12 months. And that could be hate crime in the street, that could be online. There's an awful lot of hate crime that happens online. Or it could be something that they experience in the workplace. 2 in 5 trans people, 41%, have experienced a hate crime or incident because of their gender identity in the last 12 months, and 1 in 6 LGBT people who aren't trans. And this was Stonewall 2017. In terms of domestic abuse, 38% of LGBT people have experienced domestic abuse. That was Donovan et al., which was the largest study into same-sex domestic abuse in the UK. There's a range of different studies. There's, difficulty in gathering data because of underreporting and the fact that police don't necessarily gather the relevant information. So they may be able to tell you who the victim is, but not necessarily the gender, not necessarily the perpetrator is. So it can be quite complex in terms of data and official stats. But a lot of research has suggested 1 in 4 LGBT people, so 1 in 4 lesbian and gay, 1 in 3 bisexual people, and 1 in 2 trans people has experienced domestic abuse from either an intimate partner or a family member. So it could be as part of a family, if you're coming out about your sexual orientation and the family aren't accepting of that. So if I give you some more local stats, we run IDVA services across the West Midlands, and probably 25% of referrals to our domestic abuse service are for so-called honour-based violence or forced marriage, and that's because people are lesbian or gay, bisexual or trans, with about 75% being intimate partner. So moving on. So the National LGBT Survey 2019, which is a piece of government research, found that at least 2 in 5 respondents had experienced an incident because they were LGBT, such as verbal harassment or physical violence in the 12 months preceding the survey. And data from the crime survey, the British Crime Survey for England and Wales, reveals that gay, lesbian and bisexual people are more likely than heterosexual people to be victims of all CSEW crime, including domestic violence, sexual violence, hate crime and harassment. And I just wanted to add that 70 countries still criminalise same-sex relationships. The death penalty for same-sex relationships is either allowed or evidence of it exists occurs in 11 of these countries. And some of these countries also practice corrective or homophobic rape, where women and sometimes men are raped because of their perceived sexual orientation. And the idea is that will correct it, that will make them heterosexual. So people who are LGBTQ and seeking asylum, I said earlier, we see a lot of people who are seeking asylum accessing our services, will often have experienced multiple trauma in the countries they are fleeing. It can also be unsafe for their families if their sexual orientation or gender identity is known. So they could have witnessed trauma. We've worked with people who've witnessed their partner being murdered, for example. They could have experienced trauma. So they will be coming to the UK carrying quite often some horrific tales of what's happened to them. And some of these experiences are unique to their LGBTQ identity. Okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit about supporting LGBTQ people who have experienced trauma. Just before I do, I just wanted to say that, as I said, I'm sure you've done a little bit, some of the presentations talked to you about the impact of trauma on the brain. What I've seen in my experience, certainly when I was more of a practitioner, I trained as a counsellor many years ago, and I've worked with victims of domestic abuse, sexual violence, and people who have complex substance misuse issues for many years. And what I found quite often was there was misdiagnosis. So people weren't necessarily diagnosed with complex PTSD. They may have been diagnosed with personality disorder because of some of the maladaptive coping strategies like self-harm or substance misuse, without clear understanding of what was happening. So there's been a movement now to what's known as trauma-informed practice, and looking at organisations to try and work in a trauma-informed way. So trauma-informed practice asks what's happened to you rather than what's wrong with you. I remember talking to somebody recently who's the clinical director of psychological services, I won't say where, and 60 people who'd been assessed in therapy were all getting assessments for symptoms. Nobody had asked what had happened to them. What they were looking at is the symptoms that were presenting. People present with symptoms for a reason. So trauma-informed practice asks what's happened to you. It tries to understand the trauma, and it prioritises safety, trust, and empowerment. Those are really important. So it's really important we focus on safety, we develop trust, and we empower survivors to learn coping strategies, to learn to manage in healthier ways, and to learn eventually to integrate the trauma so they can talk about their experiences as lived experiences without experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder and symptoms around it. And I think it's also important to recognise the additional complexities and barriers LGBTQ plus survivors face. LGBTQ plus survivors quite often don't access mainstream services because they don't think they're for them. When they do, they may experience homophobia, biphobia, transphobia or prejudice from service providers who don't have the right level of cultural competence and haven't had the right level of training to work appropriately, supportively with them. So put here, understand maladaptive coping strategies, i.e. self-harm, as a way of surviving in the present and a reaction to complex trauma. Be non-judgmental. This is keeping somebody alive. Might be the only thing that's keeping them alive. So work in an LGBTQ affirmative way. And be prepared to discuss experiences of homophobia, biphobia and transphobia, because that's the additional level. People may already have experienced trauma on a daily basis through being rejected, not being accepted, experiences of violence and aggression. So if something else happens on top, if on top of that they're in an abusive relationship or they survive childhood abuse, there are going to be more complexities. Just a note there as well, for LGBTQ survivors, coming out can be really difficult. So if you're a man and you're sexually abused by a man as a child, you have all sorts of issues around masculinity. And if you're gay, you're thinking, did that happen because I'm gay? Is it because of me? Because many people internalise self-blame. So it's going to be really difficult accepting your identity if you've been abused by somebody of the same sex. So there's some complexities that go on that may not happen. I mean, it's complex for all victims, but there are additional issues to be aware of in terms of those experiences. And I just wanted to say, coming out, LGBTQ people do it all the time. It doesn't happen once. And while it can be positive and affirming and people being able to self-actualize and be the whole of themselves, they don't know how people are going to react every time they do that. So that's a process that people are constantly going through. So if people are experiencing flashbacks or reliving experiences, it's really important to ground them in the here and now. Stay calm and supportive and encourage them to breathe mindfully, encourage some diaphragmatic breathing, so deep breathing, so people can ground. And again, if you're grounding people, it's really important to ground people through 5 senses. I'm not going into lots of detail about the impact of trauma on the brain, because I think that's probably happened in previous presentations. But if people are reliving and re-experiencing, they're in a state of hypervigilance where they're being flooded with fight and flight hormones, and they're actually re-experiencing what happened to them. So getting people to ground through 5 senses in the here and now is really important. So smells that are comforting, not smells that are triggering. They might carry a handkerchief with lavender, for example, if that's something that's calming for them. They need to identify that. Having photos of family they can look at, getting them to talk about where they are, what they can see, what they can feel if they're disassociating, reassuring them that this isn't happening, that it's a flashback, so that they have some knowledge and understanding of what's happening to them, because knowledge is power. Learning to manage symptoms can be really important for people, and it takes away some of the distress. So someone who has PTSD could be in a state of hypervigilance where their nervous system is stuck in a state of constant alert. So it's getting people to manage those symptoms, teaching people mindfulness or getting them to get involved in that can be really helpful. But also a word of warning, opening them up and encouraging them to talk further about these experiences could make these symptoms worse. So if somebody's in when we were at rape crisis, we would have called it crisis. We'd have said if somebody was in crisis, so experienced flashbacks, having nightmares, then that wouldn't be the time to open them up and get them to talk about it. That's the time to ground them. You get them to talk about it when they're in the here and now, not when they're reliving, because as counsellors historically, we've been trained to open people up and get them to talk, but that can make those symptoms worse because they're re-experiencing them. So it's learning ways of coping with that and recognising what the symptoms are and how to calm somebody down and ground them. Teaching people grounding techniques, which I just mentioned, can empower them to manage symptoms. And it's also important to help people recognise any triggers. So people will have triggers. There will be things that can trigger that reaction in the brain, and that could be a certain smell, it could be a place, it could be bumping into somebody who you associated with what happened at the time. So if people can recognise their triggers, they can develop a safety plan or a plan of action so that they're not exposed to them, and also learn some of those coping strategies like mindful breathing. There are exercises you can do where people can develop safe spaces, where they can go in their brain to protect themselves, and where they can get grounded. So there's a whole load of techniques that people can have to help them with these experiences, which can be really distressing for people. So always focus on safety and what feels safe for the person. Develop a safety plan with them so they can identify what helps them to feel safe. And that can include, as I just mentioned, identifying triggers, minimising exposure to triggers. And some of this work's really important because you may be working with somebody who doesn't know what safe feels like, who doesn't know how to keep safe because they've never been safe. So it's really important to get them to focus on not just physical safety, but what's emotionally safe for them, what feels safe, how will they be safe. So developing a safety plan, again, is a really empowering tool. Encouraging them to use distancing techniques, which distances them from the emotions. So keeping a journal can be really helpful as a way of understanding your experiences, rationalizing them, and also distancing from the emotions. And the process of writing can help with the symptoms of hypervigilance. So actually the process of writing something down or typing can be calming because it kicks the opposite side of the brain into action. Encourage them to get a diagnosis, and if they are ready, therapy to deal with what happened to them. Trauma-informed CBAT has been really helpful for some people, as has Gestalt therapy for survivors with PTSD symptoms. So there's a range of options if they're ready. It has to come from them. And it's also about recognising that surviving's hard work. If you've worked with survivors, it's really hard work. People will have to put all their energy into surviving and processing some of these experiences and working through them. And it's actually okay if people don't want to do that. If all they want to do is learn a few strategies to manage symptoms, that's okay too. So I think it's really important to recognise that this has to come from the individual experiencing the trauma. It's about them taking back control, because when they experience trauma, they would have had no control. They would have been powerless. So it's about them taking back power. And I've also added eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDRD, which is a fairly new treatment, can also help reduce PTSD symptoms. So there's a range of options available to therapists, counsellors, and people working with victims of trauma, victims advocates, even though they won't be doing therapy, can still teach people things like mindfulness, and they can learn grounding techniques to support people to manage symptoms. So just wanted to do a little bit about looking after yourselves, because if you're doing research and you're researching with people who are describing their experiences of trauma, you could be hearing some really unpleasant things. So vicarious trauma is about looking after yourself. Preventive vicarious trauma and recognising it is about looking after yourself. Vicarious trauma is the effect of being exposed to someone else's trauma, trauma that you have not personally experienced, but you've learned about it from others. Symptoms of vicarious trauma can be similar to PTSD symptoms, and it can include a host of symptoms, but it can include stress, nightmares, hypervigilance, feeling unsafe, missing work, anxiety and depression. It can also be feelings of powerlessness, feelings you can't do anything to change it, feeling overwhelmed. Sometimes people feeling they want to make it better, they want to do more and they can't. So some of it's about recognising your boundaries and what you can do to support somebody and what you can't, and actually recognizing the importance of being non-judgmental and listening to somebody. Those things can be really valuable for somebody who may not have been listened to or believed all of their life. And then I put, when working with people who have experienced trauma, it's important to look after your own mental health and well-being. So get support. Debrief with a colleague or line manager if you've listened to difficult conversations. Don't hold it. Don't take it home. So if you were doing an interview and it was particularly traumatic, make sure you've booked in something with somebody to talk that through so that you can leave it, so that you're not taking it home. You know, if you have access to online counselling services or anything like that, if you're recognising that you're experiencing symptoms after it, please talk to somebody, because it's really important that we recognise that we can be impacted by hearing some of the horrific experiences people have had. And I thought, manage your caseload, don't take on too much, and recognise when you need time out. So it's okay not to take on too much. It's okay to recognise you need a break. You can't be everything to everybody. And I think sometimes, because we want to make things better, we want to help, because people in the caring professions want to make a difference, we do burn out because we try and do too much. Practice self-care and manage your work-life balance. That's really important. And I've also put here, which was something I was talking about in terms of supporting victims, learn mindfulness and meditation techniques, as this can be really beneficial for managing any hypervigilance and stress responses that you may experience. So I think those things are really important in terms of how we look after ourselves. I think that's it for me. So any questions? So I'll stop the share and take any questions anybody might have.
That's great. Thank you very much.